Oh, hello everyone, and welcome to Head to Head, an Open Dialogists production. And it's a real pleasure for me today. I'm being joined by an old friend, a mentor, and an all-round jolly good influence and good egg, Mr. Simon Richards. Simon, really, really delighted to have you with me tonight.
Likewise, an absolute pleasure, Bill. As you mentioned, we both go back quite a way, and it's always great to talk to you.
Well, yeah, we certainly do go back a way, and today we're gonna get through quite a few things. I'm going to briefly say that for those who don't know, and if you don't, shame on you. Simon Richards is the former chief exec of the Freedom Association, which is a wonderful organisation, one of the first organisations that I properly got involved with many years ago when I started in politics. And his career has spanned quite a long while. I think to say that without emphasising it too much, but really, this is one of the guys who was involved in fighting for Brexit before it was a fashionable thing to do, and with the efforts of Simon, really pushing it along. He was one of the main people, I think, was a great architect of the British Brexit movement. So, Simon, if you will, let's try and start at the beginning, and tell us a little bit about where you started out and how you got into the world of the TFA and your move into being the man we know now from your involvement in politics.
Well, unlike you, Bill, you're mere youth. I'm pretty ancient, and I really got involved very early on, actually, at school. You can work out how ancient I am. Let's just say the wrong side of 60, but not too far. Back in the 1974 to 79 Labour government, pretty catastrophically bad government, frankly. There's a surprise, isn't there? And I think one's early experiences, do mould one. And then most people now just don't remember what an absolute shambles Britain was. And before anybody says, "Oh, that was because we weren't in the EU," it was nothing of the sort. In fact, we had joined the EU under Ted Heath before, but it was really seeing the trade union control of this country, seeing us as the sick man of Europe, as we were called then. Strikes were rampant, and I remember seeing an opinion poll saying that the man running the Transport and General Workers Union, which was the biggest union at the time, Jack Jones, that most people thought he had more power than the Prime Minister. That's how bad things had got. And I think there was a sense of this country sort of losing belief in itself. And I would strongly argue that actually one of the reasons I think we joined the EU was that people, certainly in the ruling class, did lose belief in Britain. And of course, joining it made things a heck of a lot worse. So I got very interested in that, and I saw a new organisation called the Freedom Association. In fact, it was a mate of mine at school. I was at the same school as Michael Heseltine, not the same time as him. He said, "Oh, look at this thing about the Freedom Association," and it was called the National Association for Freedom then. That was a mouthful. And he sent off for info, and I joined back then, which was 1975, which was the same year that Margaret Thatcher became leader. And I must say, for the first time in my admittedly relatively short life, I saw a leader in Margaret Thatcher that I thought actually believed in something and believed in Britain. And everybody until then, as far as I could see, was sort of very apologetic about this country, and just didn't seem to be speaking from the heart. And I don't need to tell you, of all people, Bill, what a tremendous success Margaret Thatcher proved in the end, of course. So that was it was a fascinating time. And it's when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. I was at that time at university. And I very strongly believed then in the actually relatively simple message that she was putting across, which was that a belief in freedom, that if you give people more freedom, they will take more responsibility. They will act better. They will work harder. The whole country is better off. So that combination, which she was very articulate, I think, in putting across, done with great passion. And of course, at the time, the Soviet Empire, then, as I always called it, the communist Soviet Empire, was a massive threat to this country. People have forgotten, I think, how I was perhaps the last generation that grew up in real fear of nuclear war. And it might happen again, but there was much greater fear of it then than now. So I found her massively inspiring, that message of freedom, and also that belief in Britain. And I think it was as a result of her success that people started again to think, well, actually, we are not such a sick country that we need to go cap in hand to Europe. That we're actually capable of running our own affairs like virtually every other country in the world. With our great history. And I think a real turning point, I won't go through all Margaret Thatcher's tremendous successes, bringing down the strike rate by 99%. I mean, if you'd said that to me, when I was at school, or to anybody else, we would have just laughed. That was not considered to be even conceivable.
Well, that gives me an opportunity actually to just briefly intervene and say that one of my main memories of that time as a slightly younger man than yourself was that my father was involved in manufacturing industry, and he was involved in dealing with a lot of strikes, and it seemed to be every other week. And bear in mind, we were in the West Midlands, really, with the hotbed of such things. And I think on Dad's 80th birthday today, I think it's only right to mention the fact that one of the main things that I do recall from my early childhood actually was the constant battle, and him coming back having had to deal with militant strikers, and quite proudly showing me headlines about him in Socialist Worker, I think it was, saying that he was some kind of stooge of the imperialist scum or something like that. But there was a real serious battle going on within our country at that time, and many people younger, you're right, Simon, they simply don't remember or don't understand that, and they put down Lady Thatcher and people who would say the things that she said then, now they would classify as far right, which is, I think, extraordinary. So, I mean, that's a bit of context, really, to what you're saying.
Yeah, no, it's so true, Bill. And as you rightly say, the West Midlands was one of the worst hit areas. I remember Red Robbo, who I think put a lot of people off the West Midlands accent very unfairly. It's much better in the actual Black Country, of course. But no, you're so right. And by the way, many happy returns to your father. 80s is a grand age to be. That's quite something special. And so really under Margaret Thatcher, Britain I think recovered its mojo. And in addition to what she did, freeing the economy, privatising the inefficient nationalised industries, taking on the trade unions, defending individual freedom, being the Iron Lady, championing the cause of the Poles and others behind the Iron Curtain, a massive world figure. But another real key moment for me, and I think still, even after all the dramatic things that have happened since, for me, perhaps the most dramatic time of all was the Falklands War. And we're coming up to an anniversary of that, I think, it'll be next year, and so there'll be more publicity for it then. But again, that's what came out of the blue. And again, I'd seen all of my sort of short life, Britain always surrender, always backing down, always appeasing, never standing up for ourselves. And here was this very clear issue of a fascist dictatorship illegally invading British territory, where all the islanders wanted to remain British. And I can remember when it happened, I thought, unfortunately, I was furious about it. I thought, well, there's nothing we can do about it. It's the other end of the world. Sadly, and appallingly, I thought, that's it, it's too late. But of course, thanks to the astonishing courage of the amazing soldiers and sailors in that task force, but also the absolutely brilliant leadership of Margaret Thatcher, those islands were regained, and that was such an important message that the force was not going to prevail, that Britain was going to stand up for right, for justice, for freedom, democracy, and for international law. And Britain's standing in the world rocketed after that. It made an enormous difference. So those are the things that sort of got me involved in the Freedom Association then. And I say I was a member right through university. When I was at university, I led a disaffiliation campaign from the then communist-controlled National Union students.
How did that go?
It successfully. We won. We won. This is King's College London. We won the first referendum. As usual, of course, the enemy insisted on another referendum. And
that sounds familiar.
Yeah, that's right. And we won by a larger majority then. Perhaps helped by a speech by the then visiting communist president of NUS, David Aronovich, against us, and so that was perhaps a sort of sign of things to come. So then I went into retailing. I wanted to sort of be, sort of a sharp end of business, but politics was always my thing, really. I set up my own little retail business, and everything was going quite nicely until and it was a coincidence, I suppose, that my political the politician I most admired sort of was frankly stabbed in the back. Let's be frank about it, by in my opinion, cowards within our own party. At just the time when I don't want to get into too much detail about this, but the Nigel Lawson tried to shadow the Deutschmark.
Yes.
This is before the euro, with something called the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism, which was the forerunner of the euro. And it was all about trying to get us more deeply into the European Union. And that, for a variety of reasons, had catastrophic results. It caused a huge increase in inflation, and which undermined everything about the Thatcher government. And Margaret Thatcher realised what Lawson was doing, but it was too late by then. And her enemies then, Heseltine, Howe, all Eurofanatics, people who were passionate about the European project, who didn't really believe in British independence, because they saw that by that stage she had worked out that Britain needed a new relationship with the European Union, let's put it like that. And of course, they saw that as a massive threat that couldn't be allowed to go ahead. So she was knifed after 3 landslide general election victories, an unparalleled achievement.
And this is an area, if I may, that I'd like us to focus on a little bit, because you touched on a few things there. The Mrs. Thatcher being taken from power, in my view, is one of the most appalling coups in our democratic history, and the Conservative Party at its very, very worst. Yes. I actually remember I was driving back from work as a young man when I heard about it, and I actually had to pull the car up to the side of the road because I was that devastated. And she never lost an election. Let's get that clear. But a lot of people since then, and I've encountered this because when I've been discussing Brexit and issues like that, and a lot of my opponents will know of my massive admiration for the lady, will always say to me, "Oh, she was pro-EU. She was always in favour of it. You're going against her legacy." And they'll quote lots of examples of things she said earlier on in the piece that were pro-common market. But the EU itself, we had a constant running battle, where people were saying, "Well, Lady Thatcher would never have taken us out." Maybe you've got some insight into that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt early on, although I think she was a bit critical, she went along with it. And people say, oh, well, there are these pictures of her in this ridiculous jumper with all the EU flags on.
Yeah.
Now, she'd only been leader of the Conservative Party for a few weeks then. She couldn't immediately, sort of announce that she was pulling out. But actually, it's true that she didn't start off being against it. But the point is that after many years of experience of it, that's what turned her into believing that we would be better off out. And I have to, and I can say this with some authority because I know people who, for example, her private secretary worked with her for over 20 years, is absolutely adamant that she became totally in favour of Britain leaving the European Union. She was absolutely 100% in favour of leaving. So is it true that earlier on, but that she was in favour of the EU? Well, yes, but that was true. I mean, I was, as a schoolboy, when I didn't really know about it, I was in favour of it, as well. Many people were for many years afterwards. But as I think the fact was that it was her experience of seeing how anti-democratic the EU was, how it always acted against Britain's interests, how there simply was no way that we could win there. That's what turned her around. So I would say that she was a lady with a very open mind, and it was her experience that brought her around, like so many other British people, frankly, to believing that the only future for us was outside the EU.
And of course, from that point, when she was usurped by not just traitors within her own party, but in my belief and my personal belief, traitors to our country, who usurped her, fifth columnists, basically. We were then headlong being forced further and further into the European project by the people who took over, what I would personally describe as quislings. Was that the time when you really, to probably miscoin a phrase, were radicalised against and decided that you were going to really start campaigning hard?
Yes, I think it was. I must admit, it was only when Margaret Thatcher made her Maastricht speech. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Bruges.
The Bruges speech. I beg your pardon. Yeah, when she made the Bruges speech, that I really woke up, I think, to the reality. And actually, that was if the EU had some sense and listened to that, it was a very reasonable thing. She was just trying to actually get the EU back to being what, in fact, I think de Gaulle had wanted, which was, Europe of nations. And it was then at Maastricht. I got the right place in the Netherlands this time. It was then at Maastricht that the EU really trying to push the whole thing into this super state, and because John Major, in my opinion, thoroughly unworthy successor to Margaret Thatcher, he forced that through again. But it was quite clear that then many people like you and me had woken up to things then, and there were some wonderful Conservative members of Parliament, people like Christopher Gill, for example, at the time, who's went on to be chairman of the Freedom Association, and many other wonderful people, Bill Cash, and some real stalwarts there, who started then to really criticise the entire project. And I think what I mentioned, I was a member of the Freedom Association, but it was I only really got sort of really deeply involved and actually started to work for it around about the sort of I suppose early years of the millennium, really, and round about 2000, and something we wrote. People were criticising the EU, and there's growing public discontent with it. But obviously the establishment was backing it. People had their snouts in the trough, let's be frank, a lot of them. But what we thought was that people weren't following it the logical extent. Nobody dared suggest leaving. Everyone was saying, well, it's not, we wanted to just be about trade and we'd like it to do this and that and the other. And there was no way that we were going to be able to outvote them. So once Maastricht had been forced through, the only real prospect, I think, for this country was to free itself from the EU. So we set up. In fact, we initially started a question. We asked a question. We produced a big one of these big advertising hoardings on a lorry, which we sent around a Conservative Party conference in Blackpool in, I think, must have been probably 2005. When Dave Cameron had just taken over, and we sent that round, and it asks the big question on it, saying, "Would we be better off out of the European Union?" So we asked the question first. By the following year, it was clear that there was an answer to that question, and we slightly changed the wording to say we would be better off out of the European Union. Yeah. And so then we launched this Better Off Out campaign.
And just before we go on to that, because you touched upon something very important about Maastricht, and you mentioned Mr. Gill, Christopher Gill, who one of the great men that I don't think I've ever met in my lifetime. And he was one of the Maastricht rebels. And if anyone's really interested in looking at the history of that time, he wrote a couple of books. One, I think, Cracking the Whip, I think was called one.
Yes, yeah.
And in that, he detailed how he was threatened by the whips that he would get his businesses, which were involved in meat processing, would get health inspections on them, and there would be checks done on them. And that explains, to such a large part, because unfortunately, not everyone had the courage that Mr. Gill had. And many of the supposed rebels to Maastricht actually backed down and allowed this thing to get through. But it's such a fascinating insight into political history and the way these things happened. And people think, oh, it was all fair and square. Well, absolutely not. And you have characters like Christopher Gill who have since that point on really tried to expose what happened and talk to people about it. And again, that link with the Freedom Association and Christopher Gill being there as one of the, as I said, I think one of the great men of politics, I think is another fascinating link in to the whole story and the way we were forced down this route in a totally, in my opinion, corrupt manner, which then led on to where we're up to in the story. So please continue on from there. Yeah.
Very good point, Bill. And that's certainly, I'm sure if people try Googling Christopher, I'm sure they'll try and dig those books out. There's some wonderful people there, and he's one of the foremost. So we then set up in spring 2006, the Freedom Association, this is, the Better Off Out campaign. And again, there are some marvelous people, because none of the people who worked their socks off to free Britain from the EU got all the gongs that that the failures on the Remain side got, and of course that's not what they were doing it for. They were doing it for the country, not for their own benefit. But someone like Philip Davis, he was a young new MP for Shipley in Yorkshire. I went up to campaign for him, and he was the first man, I believe, in the House of Commons to say, in fact, in his maiden speech, that he wanted to leave the European Union, and that was sort of treated as sort of as heresy. It was like daring to criticise the National Health Service, but don't get me onto that one. But he had that courage. Philip Hollowburn is another wonderful person, started off. And there's so many of those Freedom Association people who fought this right to the end. There's some marvelous people there now. The people like Julian Lewis, Andrew Rosendale, and many others as well. So yes, and I remember vividly the launch when we had the launch of the Better Off Out campaign, as you call it, in April 2006. I can remember going to the meeting and actually rather dreading it, because I thought there'd probably only be Philip there. Philip Davis, that is, with us. But as an MP, I genuinely didn't think there'd be anybody else, and I was very pleasantly surprised, and much of it's down to Philip's own efforts, frankly, that there was quite a full committee room of people from different political parties as well, who got that going. So, but at the time, I remember people thinking, this is pie in the sky. You can't leave the European Union. But I remember, when I was a little, not many years before that, all those people who said the Soviet Union can't come to an end. You can't end communism. You can't get rid of the Berlin Wall. Those will be there forever. Well, we all know what happened with those. Same people, many of them said, we couldn't get the Falklands back, I mentioned before. Actually, often if you've got the will and if it's a just cause, it's amazing how much can be achieved. And, it was a long battle then, after 2006, we were only amongst many, but we were right in there at the start. And one of the things I feel rather proud of what we did then, and by the way, full credit, for example, to Mark Wallace, who did a brilliant job on that and continues to do a superb job at Conservative Home. But one of the things that we did was we tried to be positive. So instead of saying, the EU is corrupt, anti-democratic, is inefficient, economic disaster, and so on, all of which are true, but plenty of people are commenting on this. But what we tried to point out was actually, no, how much better we would be off, outside. So, we emphasised that, we could be like all these other countries, which made our own decisions, that we could also have much better links with the third world, which is, these developing countries were treated appallingly by the common agricultural policy, which would keep their agricultural exports out of the EU, and in return would dish out, some aid to corrupt dictators.
Well, I've seen much of that at first hand when I was out there. The policies of the EU, which are supposedly all about very lovely, kind, and all the rest of it, they're actually plunging people in the third world into deeper crises because they can't actually trade their way out of it. It forces them to need aid, which comes with string attached. And it's all part of the imperial reach of the EU. And I just want to touch back as well about Philip Davis, because he's a gentleman who I've always held a lot of respect for and had a lot of time with and had some good exchanges with. And we would, I think, both classify ourselves as Tebby Tories. I think that would be the way we used to speak about it back in the day. And Philip is, when you talk about energy, his huge amounts of energy. He's also completely unchanged by having been in Parliament. He's still a blunt Yorkshireman, and he's anyone who's perhaps a little bit of a politics geek like I am will have watched him many times at Question Time over the years, fiercely facing up to his prime ministers of the day with some pretty strident and strong lines in questioning and not batting an eyelid at the response. He's the kind of MP who I think, most of us think, well, we'd like to have him on our side. That's the kind of guy. And so having him involved in the Freedom Association as well is another massive bonus, because you can think of few greater warriors on the side of freedom in the metaphorical sense than Philip.
So true, every word of that, Bill. And what I think is so amazing about Philip is that along with his tremendously principled stand on all manner of issues, and his robust advocacy of his causes, is tremendous good humour. He's got an amazing laugh, and I've never seen him sort of lose his rag. He treats things with a wonderful sense of humour, and I wish more were like that. Absolutely marvellous, man.
Yeah, well, I think the closest I saw him to that was when he was having a debate with Alex Dean
Oh, I heard about
at a
that.
fringe meeting when they were discussing the merits of CCTV cameras, and it got quite passionate. But if you can imagine, I'm sure a lot of people watching know who Alex Dean is as well,
Yeah,
and neither one of them gave an inch, and it was fantastic box office. Actually, it was well worth going to the fringe event. So anyway, to get back on track before I embarrass Philip and Alex too much by recounting that tale, um, to get back onto track. So you set up Better Off Out, and I recall from my limited time when I was in the Conservative Party that joined about 2009, left 2011ish, that it was considered quite naughty to be a member of Better Off Out, even at the low level of the party I was at. The fact that I was supporting it was frowned on, to say the very least. And I think that went all the way through, didn't it?
it did, very much so. And actually, Philip again was always very positive about it. He said the whips didn't give him any grief because I think they knew it was a waste of time. And there was actually a minor advance in that it shows how things have changed. That the people, those MPs who signed up for Better Off Out, they didn't actually have the whip withdrawn. Now that was seen to be an advance. I mean, that shows how bad things were. But they were ruled out of serving on the front bench in any shape or form. So any MP daring to sign up for Better Off Out was essentially saying goodbye to any form of promotion, even to just be a PPS, bag carrier.
And I think there was a knock-on further down the line as those of us who were trying to become candidates. If we were associated with it, we had an immediate black mark against our name,
Yes.
which was one of the many reasons why I was never chosen. But it was certainly one of those that I was made aware of, that once you've associated yourself with that, forget it. It's not going to happen.
I've got to say, Bill, that you're pretty too modest to say it yourself. But you are one of the most principled people I've ever come across, as well as being a friend. Somebody who's always stood up for your principles, and to hear people in the Conservative Party sort of treat you as you were some kind of traitor was absolutely scandalous. I thought you were treated so shabbily, because to my mind you were one of the best genuine Conservatives out and patriots out, and some of the treatment that was meted out to you is an absolute disgrace.
Well, thank you, Simon. And I one of the nicest comments I've had, aside from your generous praise there, was when I was at a Freedom Association event and you'd invited me to speak, and I was told that this very sort of dyed-in-the-wool Conservative person said, "I can't understand why you're not in the Conservative Party. You're the most conservative person I've ever met." And I said, "Well, yeah, that's actually why I ended up in UKIP because I wasn't allowed to move forward." And of course, it showed the self-destructive nature of that style within the Conservative Party at the time, because they forced out people like myself and one or two others who were members, and we went to UKIP. And we formed a patriotic Conservative Party of sorts, which had quite significant effect, and it was their fault. They didn't need to do that. They speak about a broad tent, and they could have had a broad tent. It could have included the Wets and the Thatcherites, but they wouldn't allow us to remain. They purged us, and it was very sad. And one of the main things, because one of the things I'm very grateful to you for, is you introduced me to Lord Tebbit. And I remember actually when I joined UKIP in quite a high-profile move, writing to Lord Tebbit and actually apologising and saying, I feel like I've sort of abandoned the ship in one sense, but I was left with no choice if I wanted to stick by my principles. And fortunately, he maintained his good terms with me, which I'll be forever grateful, because he's, as you know, one of my very, very greatest heroes. And I'll always be grateful for the opportunity you gave me to meet him. I mean, he was a staunch supporter of what you were doing, wasn't he, really?
Oh, very much so, and he's a real hero of mine as well. I mean, just such a great man, and his wisdom, and again his good humor actually. But I always feel with him, he never misses a trick. The pieces he writes for the Telegraph now, they're witty, they're wise. He's very shrewd as well as very decent and good man. Great man. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I do recall speaking to him in 2010 when I was campaigning for the Conservatives, and he told me exactly what I would hear on the doorsteps in Dudley, and he knew exactly because I'd been out there knocking the doors, and I didn't want to bother him with the troubles we were getting the message over for the Conservative Party, but he told me straight away. He said people will want to make sure that they're better off working. People will want a more patriotic approach and hard along with the EU, and people will want immigration controls. And he was absolutely bang on, bang on. And this is a man who hadn't been in frontline politics for many years. I'm not even sure if he'd ever set foot in Dudley, but he knew exactly what a blue collar area with patriotic values wanted, and that explains to me so much of why the Conservatives won so many seats like that back in those days. And it took until this insane Labour Party that we've had recently for them to retake some of that ground.
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, he was the greatest prime minister the Conservative Party's never had. There's never been, such a great man. What I found very disturbing, sort of move on a little bit, perhaps, but related to this, is that well, I suppose it was from after 2016, when after the great referendum victory. The Conservative Party went back to its worst ways then, and under Theresa May, and again the whips, then the pressure, then using every bit of combination of bribes and threats, the pressure there was on anybody who dared stand up for the genuine Brexit that people have voted for was enormous, and the party really was. And it was like going back to the sort of the worst of the sort of Heath years in many ways. There was absolute ruthless, ruthless opposition to anybody who dared stand up against the EU, and it was a very, very grim time. I must say. I mean, I know this year has been very difficult for so many people, obviously, because of the coronavirus business. But for me personally, it was 2019 that I hated. I thought that Theresa May just didn't appear to be responsive to any reason at all, and trying to sort of put the case for standing up to the EU and not being walked over by them. It was. I just felt like banging my head against a brick wall at times then, and it all ended for the good. But those sort of the Conservative Party really went backwards badly in that time.
Well, of course, it could be argued as well that those years of the May premiership cost us. They cost us opportunities to do trade deals around the world, most notably with an American government, which was desperate to try and get a trade deal done with us. I was over there in the States a few times and had people close to the administration saying, "Why won't your government speak to us?" And yes. the truth was because they wanted to stay tied to the EU. And so it was yet more underhand stuff. But I think you've skirted over it and moved past some areas where we could talk about your inputs, because I remember you being very active in the referendum campaign for a start. And I have some good memories of sharing platforms with you as we were trying to get the message out there. What's your, having worked so long and so hard against so much opposition to get us to the point of a referendum, what are your fondest recollections of that period?
Yeah, I think for me, what we tried to do in the Better Off Out campaign was to attempt to bring together where we could, as best we could, the people from the two, dare I say, warring factions. It essentially, principally, I mean, there are about 1,000 factions, but the two main ones, obviously, being the two main political parties, the UKIP and the Conservatives. And I must admit, that was the bane of my life. I mean, because I don't know which was worse in many ways. So many of the Tories, were not genuinely, anti-EU at all. They would pretend to be Eurosceptic. So many of the UKIP people were just so ferociously hostile to anything that the Conservatives did in a Eurosceptic way. So, and the two that used to drive me nuts, they're attacking each other all the time. And there was never any thanks for trying to bring people together. But that's what we did. But what I would say, and I think is, I've criticised both parties there, and I think with good reason. But at the same time, I want to give credit where it's due. And so many people say to me, it was all down to Nigel, or it was all down to Boris, whatever. And I think the truth is that, and I have massive admiration, by the way, for Nigel Farage. Certainly, in my opinion, Brexit would never have been achieved without him. I think the most brilliant political operator since Margaret Thatcher. But what I think was good in a way was that, yes, without the pressure that Nigel Farage put on with the success that UKIP had electorally, it would never happen. I absolutely don't dispute that. But something that's had perhaps a bit less attention is that I think also without the threat that Cameron came under from his own backbenches, and this is I think where we played quite a large part, from the likes of Philip Davis, but there were many, that number started growing. It was like a pincer movement on him, really. UKIP, at the polls, hitting the Conservatives and threatening his position as Prime Minister, Cameron's position as Prime Minister. And then from his own backbenches, people starting to get seriously restive and demanding, a more Eurosceptic position. And one of the unsung heroes in that, in my opinion, I haven't mentioned him, is a chap called David Nuttall. And he got into Parliament for the first time in that 2010 general election that Cameron won, and within no time at all, he brought in this referendum bill. It came out of the blue. I think he had the private member circles, and he was a master of the way the House worked, and it coming out of the blue. Cameron put a 3-line whip on to stop people voting against, but there was a huge number. I forget the precise number. It was around about 100. Quite unheard of number that voted for this bill, and that shocked Cameron deeply. It really did, because he had this second front opening then from his own backbenches, far bigger numbers than there'd ever been before. And this wasn't just a Eurosceptic move. This was straight. This was for a referendum to leave. Yeah. It was, in my opinion, it was the combination of the work that David Nuttall was, after Philip Davis was chairman of our Better Off Out campaign in the Commons, a wonderful, modest but wonderful man. It was that combination with the tremendous work that Nigel was doing in the European Parliament and around the country, and that UKIP were doing, that forced Cameron's hand to have that referendum. So, although it did drive me nuts, I do think at the same time, I think that's what I'm pleased with what we did in the Better Off Out campaign. We did try to at least keep people talking on our side, which wasn't always easy.
Well, I can imagine it.
Funny enough, I always found it was, in a weird way, actually, if we had a meeting where there were both UKIP and Eurosceptic Tories present, oddly enough, I always found everyone was on their best behaviour because they didn't sort of want to let the side down. It seemed to be unreasonable. But if you got just UKIP people on their own together, or just Tories on their own together, they'd be at each other's throats.
Yes. I do recall that there were many times. I know Nigel is a great politician, but he can occasionally be a bit blunt and a little difficult to deal with. But I remember him approaching Vote Leave on several occasions and reporting back to us in Brussels, and basically having been treated appallingly. And it takes a lot for Nigel Farage to offer an olive branch to anyone. That is not Nigel. It never will be. But he saw the importance of what was going on, and he did try and extend olive branches. And he was, I found he was treated appallingly. And I think that whilst I certainly tried to play the game and work with anyone who I considered a patriot, I can see it was very, very difficult at times, because there was it felt almost a snobbish approach from the Tory side to the UKIP side, that we were, the riffraff. But I appreciate that without the Tories on side, and one of our viewers has just put something in about Boris Johnson being an opportunist, which a comment came on the screen. Now, I'm probably going to open that for your view if you wish shortly, but I think he is. But I'm delighted that he was an opportunist on our side, because he got across sections of the country that we couldn't have got. And we got out there on the streets with thousands of UKIP activists and spoke to people in parts of the country who couldn't abide Boris Johnson, and assured them that they were voting for Brexit, not for Boris. And that helped, so that the two sides complemented each other. But for me, Simon, and I'll put you a little bit on the spot with this, anyone who has to write two essays, one in favour of the EU and one in favour of leaving, is not a patriot and not a true leaver.
Well, I agree with you about a lot of that, but I think I'll take Boris's side on this one. And I'll say, well, I think your analysis of it before was absolutely correct, that ultimately you needed both. You're not going to win a referendum without those sort of the more establishment type Tories. And also you weren't going to win it without the numbers, the masses that Nigel brought in. So I think it was essential that you had both. I completely agree with you, by the way, that I think Nigel was treated very shabbily, continues to be treated very shabbily. And I'm very much a believer in Churchill's maxim, in defeat, defiance, in victory, magnanimity. And I don't think that's been shown to Nigel or UKIP generally, which I very much regret. In defence of Boris, I would say you've got to look at it this way, that he came from a family. His father was a Europhile MEP. His sister, as you've seen, is a Eurofanatic. His brother's is a Europhile. He came from a family of Europhiles. He had, when he made his name for himself, writing on the Telegraph as their Brussels correspondent, he, I think, did more than anybody other than Nigel to actually make people realise the failings of the European Union. And at that time, people weren't saying, Brexit wasn't being discussed, but he was clearly very Eurosceptic, and he had a good record on that, frankly. And then so when it eventually came to the crunch, when you look at what he was, everybody knew where Nigel's position was. That was easy for him. It would have been a shock if he'd decided he was against Brexit then. But if you look at what Boris had, he realised that virtually all of his friends would probably send him to Coventry. He probably realised also, as would be the main figurehead, he would become. This is a man who liked being liked. Don't we all? But he more than most. He would become a figure of perhaps the greatest hatred of any leading politician, for a century, even more than the vile hatred the left used to spew out against Margaret Thatcher. This was a man, he was a sort of metropolitan type, he's a Londoner, twice elected mayor of London. So the amount he had to lose was enormous. And this is a man who'd always wanted to be prime minister.
Yeah.
So I don't think I don't think it was unreasonable for him to say before. He could have glibly said, "Oh yeah, I'm all for it. Come on, bit of whiff waff." Or he could have gone the other way. But I think when you looked at what was at stake, I don't think it's at all an unreasonable thing to look at, well, what are the pros and minuses of this. I actually think it's a very good thing to do, and in fact, I always like to think of that. You think, right, what are they going to throw at me? What are the weaknesses in our case? It's what barristers and people do, isn't it? And I don't think it follows actually that he was just completely cynical. Now, is he as pure a Brexiteer as Nigel? No, he isn't. But ultimately, as you yourself, I think, suggested, Bill, you need. I mean, I saw this in the Thatcher. I was a true Thatcher believer, as you were, but I noticed that, after she'd won a couple of elections, a lot of other people came on board. The sort of people who like to be on the winning side. I mean, I can remember someone like, Richard Branson, the classic, he was making all sorts of, sort of pro-Thatcher noises then, because there was money in it for him, bluntly. And when Blair started winning, he went over to Blair. That's, a lot of people do that, but you'll never win if you just have the true believers. And I think you suggested that yourself. But what I don't think about, there's a lot I would criticise Boris for. He's not in the same league as Margaret Thatcher, in my opinion. But where I do think, I don't know if you've read the book he wrote about Winston Churchill. It's a tremendous read. I mean, one thing about Boris, I think Nigel is the best speaker I've seen in my lifetime, political speaker. I think he's absolutely brilliant. But as a writer, and Boris, I don't think, is as good a public speaker as Nigel, anywhere near. But he does write superbly well. If he's just got that. He's a very experienced journalist, and his stuff is very readable. And his book on Churchill. And the reason I mention this in particular is that it's not a magisterial study of 2,000 pages or anything like that. The sort of thing that wonderful Dr. Heffer might write. But it doesn't pretend to be. It's an easy read. And what he does, I think, very cleverly in it, is he takes every single, and this was written before the referendum, was it the Brexit referendum? He takes every single negative that's thrown at Churchill, and he knocks it down essentially. So he puts the case, quite offensive case that suggests Churchill was some kind of dreadful racist imperialist, and all these things about that Churchill was is insincere and he was inconsistent and that he was a warmonger, all these sort of things. And he he's quite open about them. He promotes them, and then he goes on to knock them down, but very powerfully. And yet at the same time in a very readable sort of way. You can't put the book down. I read it in a day.
You've given me an idea. We should do a program about Churchill one of these days. I think you've given,
yes,
because that would take up a whole hour at least on its
own.
But I mean,
that's my defence of Boris.
I take it on board.
Actually, just very briefly. Sorry to interrupt, but very, very briefly, just want to say the thing about what he sort of really, I think, pointed out was that Churchill, he chopped and changed. He was a liberal and he was conservative, but he had a sort of feel for the nation. He had a feel for what people. The right thing to do for the country and what people, and I think Boris has some of that. I'm not saying that he's as great a man as Churchill, but he has some of that, I think.
Well, that's a rather very strong praise indeed. I think it remains to be seen myself about whether or not Boris lives up to that. I certainly like to see him live up to some of the qualities of Lady Thatcher and Winston Churchill when it comes to freedom. He seems to have forgotten a little bit of that, but that's a subject for another time. We're running relatively low, so I still want to just pack in a couple of things. I think we've both been very hot water if we didn't mention another key figure who you've worked with and who was involved with the Freedom Association, and that is a former guest on this show, Roger Helmer, who I'm sure you've got many a fond memory of Roger.
Oh yeah, I have. Roger's such a good man, and you won't get a truer patriot than him. And again, another thing that strikes me about Roger is a bit like with Philip Davis. He's got pretty robust views, I think, Roger, on everything. But he's also a real gent, and I don't mean that in that he's to the manner born or anything. But I mean, he's got a very courteous manner. I think I always found his interviews, I found him most persuasive, and really, I regard Roger as a real good friend, and a really staunch Brexiteer. And one of my favourite moments of Roger was I remember going to the European Parliament once, and they did a ridiculous thing called a Nagora, whereby all these basically pro EU pressure groups could go and have a sort of junket, really, on the EU taxpayer, and they were all. But Roger was then our chairman of the Freedom Association, and he said he'd see if he could get us in, which he did. So I went along there. And I can remember seeing, I was very proud of him sitting in the doing the Daily Telegraph crossword at incredible speed on the thing. I thought that's probably the most useful activity I'd seen in that ridiculous hemisphere. Yes. And I made a very sort of strongly anti-EU speech, with a bit of humour and everything. And it was quite a hard line, but delivered. Because I was an inexperienced speaker, I wasn't used to, delivered in a sort of fairly sort of gentlemanly sort of way, sort of conversational way, and nobody really batted an eyelid. Then Roger stood up, and he really gave it there with both barrels, and they were slow hand clapping him and cheering him. He wasn't saying anything probably as hard line as I was, but because he said it so powerfully and everything, he really got them going, and I felt really proud of him. Great man.
Yes, indeed. And Roger Helmer's Telegraph crossword solving was one of the best acts of defiance that I saw in that parliament, because every time someone came on giving us the normal propaganda, up it would come, and he'd be working his way through. He said, no, it was, I think, dumb insolence and very well done. They thoroughly hated him for that, and many other things, which to me is a mark of respect. We're coming to the end, Simon, which is such a shame, because I've really enjoyed this. As ever, when I speak to you, it feels like time flies by incredibly quickly.
The two of us could go on forever, but preferably with a pint in hand,
Well, wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice? We'll have to. One day we can hope and pray. Last couple of minutes. What is life now? What is the future for Simon Richards after having? We haven't even honestly skimmed the iceberg of all the work that Simon did during his time fighting for our country and our independence. We haven't touched it. But after all those years, now retired from the Freedom Association, although the Freedom Association continues, what does Simon Richards do now? What is next?
I'm planning. I've got a whole load of sort of years of junk to clear up here, and I've been held up a bit doing that because of the lockdown. But I'm planning at some point, it's probably going to be next year now, of going east. No, not go west, young man. Going east. And I want to see what I can do to honour the achievements and record and memory of Margaret Thatcher in her hometown of Grantham, because her centenary will be coming up of her birth in 2025. And I want to sort of get something that might be doing sort of tours and things, and it would be great to have a sort of birthplace centre or something there. So that's what I want to do. And the reason for that is that I've seen, the time, some a lot of political leaders, and she was special. It's not sort of, all the stuff about iconic handbags and everything. That's not what it was about. She was a really great, principled, and effective leader, and I think that's something that is worth promoting for history and for the generations coming up.
Well, Simon, when you do that, and I think I've mentioned this in the past to you, I will do anything I can to support you because I think it is a wonderful cause, and who better to do it than you? But yeah, a wonderful cause. Simon, the time's up. I'm quite sad about that, really.
Same here. Yeah, I'm
I've
sure
been
our
enjoying
viewers
myself.
won't. Your viewers won't be, but I certainly am. I've really enjoyed
No,
it.
I've really
Pleasure.
enjoyed myself.
Same
I
here.
just want to say, in passing, definitely one of the unsung heroes of Brexit. I don't think you got anywhere near the credit you deserve. I saw at first hand what you did. While some of the rest of us maybe got some more headlines and maybe got a little bit more of a glamorous life and the ups and downs, you were there working away, trying to bring together warring factions, being diplomatic, charming, and at the same time strong. And only you could have done what you did. Believe me, only you could. To have been loved in both camps is almost impossible. And I also, personally, on a personal note, I wouldn't have achieved anything that I managed to do in politics without your guidance and help and support. I shall be always grateful for that. So it's been a great honour to have you on the show, Simon, and I do hope we'll speak again soon. And with that, I just want to say thanks again, and we have to wrap it up. So, to the viewers, please share this around, show people, talk about this. If you like it, subscribe to Open Dialogus. Simon is active on social media, so if there's any questions come from this, I'm sure he'll be open to continuing the debate. And from all of us here at Head to Head, and from me and the very great Simon Richards, a great man, it's good night.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's been such a pleasure.